Hit the leech.
Good old ice one.
Good old jig leech.
It's crazy that as many times as you passed it through there,
Literally right in front of this rock.
you finally did it.
Yep. What? What happened?
Painful. That's what that was. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's been in this type of situation before, where you're bringing in a big fish, it's a couple of feet from your net, and you just feel that line pop. Man. What happened? In my experience as a fly fishing guide and my lifelong experience as an avid fly fisherman, one of two things happens. One, either you're using too light of tippet and you've got a clean break, or two, which in my opinion is even more painful, is your knot fails. How you know that your knot fails is that you check the end of your line and there'll be a little pigtail at the end. That's how you'll know that your knot had failed on you. That's what we're going to be getting into today. I've got a bunch of flies laid out in front of me, everything from micro streamers all the way up to big pike and musky flies. And we're going to be going over the tippet to fly ratio. How big is your fly and what size tippet do you want to use for that fly to avoid these kind of mistakes from your line breaking or even worse, your knot failing. Let's get into it. So I've got a few examples right here in front of me. As I said, everything from micro streamers all the way up to huge pike and musky flies here. Number one, the most important thing is the size of your hook. So these micro streamers are tied on anything from a size 8 jig hook all the way up to a size 18 jig hook. And then we've got the other side, the other end of that, is these flies are tied on 3, 4, 5/0 hooks. So huge hooks, huge flies. Definitely going to be much different tippet you're going to use on these flies versus your micro streamers. So hook size is very important. The other major factor in that is the type of hook that you are using. So if we take a little closer look at these micro streamers, this jig hook, the gauge on this wire is pretty heavy. That's a pretty heavy wire. What that's going to do is that's going to tell you if you've got a heavier gauged hook, then you need to go up in size on your tippet. Where normally we can get away with 4 or 5x tippet on this size of a fly, if you have a bigger gauge, you definitely want to go heavier than 4x. I was on 4x tippet on that footage where you just saw where I lost that big trout. This is what I was on, and I was using this streamer right here, and the knot failed on that. And I did a little bit of practicing and studying. Of course I was practicing my knots after that, thinking, man, what the heck happened? Like, I thought my knots were spot on. It wasn't necessarily my knot that was the issue. It was the fact that I was going with too light of tippet on a heavy gauged hook. So because of that heavy gauge, if you look at it, you can see a little closer. Well, now I got some heavier tippet on there. Because of that heavy gauge, that tippet really has to work further around that heavy gauged eyelet, right? So if you're using really light tippet and you tie your normal knot, it's not necessarily your knot, it's actually the fact that the hook is heavier. So you have to take that into consideration when you're choosing tippet size for your fly. After I lost that fish, I went up to some 2x tippet for these guys actually. Now 2x tippet, as you can see over here, normally I'm going to be throwing like small crayfish patterns for bass. We're starting to get into some bass flies and big trout streamers like these guys. That is kind of on the lighter end for these type of flies, but it'll work depending on basically on how you hook set. If you've got a heavy hand, which I tend to have a heavy hook set because I love going after pike and muskie, so I'm doing that a lot. So when I downsize and I'm starting to go after bass and trout, and even down into these micro streamers, I can tend to have a heavy hand when I go and do that hook set. If you want to go smaller, that's where you're going to start getting into nymph-sized tippet, like 5 and 6X tippet. But we're not talking about that today. We're focusing on streamers. Then we move up to some big game changers like this guy right here, and some bigger crayfish patterns, minnow patterns. These are things I'm going to be throwing after bass and even big trout as well. The big mistake that I made when I had first started streamer fishing for trout, pike, muskie is I was having a hard time gauging what size line I needed. But what makes this easy is that if you just go based off of the size of the fly you have and the gauge of the wire that you're using, like this one is thinner. The gauge wire on this fly is a little thinner. It's not as heavy as, say, like the ratio to these micro streamers. It's a little bit different. So I could, if I wanted to, I could throw lighter line for this guy, but it's just not necessary. It's not necessary with these big flies. Fish do not care how heavy your line is with big streamers. It does not matter. You're not getting any more stealthy by throwing a lighter tippet, which was my theory when I was throwing these micro streamers. I thought, oh, it'll give me an edge, right? Let me go with some lighter tippet. I can handle that. I can do it. And that'll give me an extra edge on the fish by going with a lighter tippet. Not the case. Not the case at all. So when I'm throwing these big game changer style minnows, articulated crayfish, now I'm going up to not tippet sizes anymore. Now I'm going to straight fluorocarbon line. This is a 12 pound. So 12 to 15 pound is roughly about the range when I start to get to flies about this size here. When you're throwing these big flies, it does not matter. Do not worry about how heavy your line is because it's not going to matter. So 12 to 15 pound when you're throwing flies like this, game changers, big streamers, again, like I said, for trout and bass, but now we're leaning more into the bass, pike, and muskie side. So now we get up to these huge flies over here. These are big 7-8 inch flies, and they get even bigger, especially for big muskie, big pike. I'm throwing this straight 25 pound. I'll do probably about a 4 or 5 foot leader. I like to keep it short with these big flies. It just makes it easier to cast them, definitely. Especially these guys. These flies right here are made out of bucktail. So if you have any experience throwing big bucktail flies like this, you know that they're really air resistant. So it takes a bigger rod, a shorter leader with heavier line to be able to chuck these guys and not kill your casting arm throughout the day. Again, it's the same thing. Once you start getting up into these big flies like this, the gauge on that wire starts to get huge. This is a 5/0 hook on this guy. It's about a 7 or 8 inch fly. That wire is huge. I mean, 25 pound is minimum. That's probably light for these guys. You can go up to 30, even 40 pound for sure. But most of the time with these guys, I'm gonna put a fly clip on, just because if I like to switch these out, a fly clip makes it easy. And with pike and muskie, they're not shy. If they're gonna slam this fly, it's not gonna matter if you have a fly clip on it. Plus, we're using wire bite, so it's just a uglier, heavy setup, and it just does not matter. So basically, I'm applying the same technique that we do for fishing big pike and muskie. Is that it doesn't matter. You can have the ugliest looking setup with wire tippet, all these nasty things attached that you think would scare off the fish, that it just does not matter. Now you go downsize to your game changers, your mini crayfish, and your micro streamers, and you can apply that same technique. Obviously, we're not throwing wire tippets or anything like that, but you can go heavier with confidence. Go up in your tippet size, and I promise you, you will not regret it. Now, some people might say, especially with these micro streamers here, they might say, well, I have no problem on 4X, 5X. That's great. That's great. If you don't have any problems, by all means, more power to you. But personally, I have a heavy hand. I'm used to throwing big flies. I like going after big pike and muskie, big bass, and you got to do that strip set, right? So when you come from that world and you go over to the trout streamers, that can create a problem. For these guys, I'm not using 4X anymore. I'm going to go minimum 3X, but what worked perfectly was this 2X. I went up to 2X for these micro streamers, And for the rest of the day, I was great. I didn't lose a single fish. None of my knots failed. And it was great. It was perfect, you know? And it didn't hinder me catching fish as well. The fish didn't care. Is basically what it comes down to. So I hope this helps you guys out. And if you have any questions, I'm always happy to help. Let's talk in the comments. I leave it wide open for you guys to ask any questions you have. Thank you guys as always for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.